Hello, and welcome to my comments on your first summer hangout on air. And I apologize that my feedback to you is a bit delayed. But you are the last remaining warriors. I really like how John described your group. Last but not the least, I enjoyed your hangouts so far. And so I'm just trying to, without going through everything you said in this session, I'm going to hit some key points that I was reflecting about when I listened to you. And obviously the recovery, you had a discussion which we continued from the previous semester on short-term versus long-term recovery, and also the issues with the recovery being the most neglected phase, particularly in that long reconstruction phase, because this is sort of when it falls out from the truly the purview of emergency management professionals, and it is more has more to do with policies of many other disciplines, and predominantly development and urban development, and a plethora of other private sector and lobbying, and it's very difficult to leverage in a cycle of emergency management process when the crises are happening in between those times of recovery for previous events. So it loses on priority and sort of shifts off that cycle when the next cycle appears. And I think you mentioned that for the longest time we did not have a policy for our national, we have a national response framework. However, we didn't have that recovery framework, and that's, on the tails of the superstorm Sandy. You finally this semester looked at national disaster recovery framework, and that was one of the independent courses. I think John mentioned that in your hangout, that there is a framework now for at least addressing the fact that it should be a priority. But I want to spend some time talking about with resiliency and the models of resiliency, discussing particularly the conceptual model by Ross this semester. I want to talk a little bit about the continuity of operation planning and discussion you had on that. And I think I really liked what John said about the continuity of operation planning. I think you mentioned that this is a plan, what we do for ourselves, how we take care of ourselves. This is how it differs from emergency operation plan. And because you are looking at COOP coming from all different backgrounds, you had some really good discussion on those elements of COOP, such as the trained personnel, the communications, the orders of succession, the staggered way of rolling it out, the training and exercises. And I think that Dalia was commenting on the fact, on her involvement in Bastrop fires, and how the orders of who is in charge of what in those particular multi-jurisdictional issue event, and where she fit in that. But this is still very much, the Bastrop fires that you referred to is still very much within the emergency operation plan, not necessarily the continuity of operations. So what the COOP truly is, or what's the most important element of it, because this was your discussion, you sort of were honing on training and exercises, maintaining databases and records, and communications. So I think between all of you, Crystal and Dalia and John and Andrea, you agreed that communications will always be the ones that challenge you, and that the databases as well. Crystal, I think, had a really good discussion. I'll get back to Crystal's discussion on databases. But I want to propose to you that none of those elements are really as important as trying to figure out your essential functions, essential mission functions. The number one for continuity of operation planning is to determine what is your essence of survival as an organization. And I will give you an example, which I've been thinking about that since you had that discussion, because I recently was nominated as a person in charge of a continuity of operation plan for the Department of Security Studies. Imagine that we actually do emergency planning at the university level. So I was in charge of continuity of operation planning and had few discussions. And if you asked for a Department of Security Studies, if you ask the faculty, what we need to do? Yes, we need to have databases, and we need to have training, and we need to be able to communicate well, all those things, and we need to have orders of succession if a chair is gone, or if a dean is gone and the chair is gone, and and so on and so forth. But if you're a faculty at the academia, you consider your research to be, sort of the cornerstone of your being. What you have done, what you've published, what you're researching, what data you're gathering, what grants you're working on. This is a huge portion of survival at the academia, right? So you would think that, as John said, we have to think how to take care of ourselves. So what is our continuity of operation planning? And you would think that at the first glance is research. Well, if you think that, then your communications will fail for the continuity of operation planning for us, because we will not survive if we don't have students. You with me? So our essential mission, our first mission that we have as a department is we have to have students to whom we provide educational delivery. If we don't have educational process of students, we don't exist. We can have research galore. You can print 10 articles in 1 year. You don't even have to be at the university. But if we don't have students enrolled, and those butts in seats, or virtual seats, so to speak, we don't exist as an institution. The university doesn't exist. So for us, the predominant function of our department is to continue educational services delivery. That's our prime mission function. Everything else is secondary, because faculty does not have to publish for a year. They will not perish if they have a break. In fact, a lot of them take sabbaticals and publish more the next year. If we don't do service, if we're not on committees, if we're not on faculty senate, all those things are irrelevant, because first you've got to make sure that you have classes. So if for our continuity of operation planning, that is our essential mission and essential function. If we don't realize that, then we're going to have communication problems, because we're going to have diverse priorities of faculty during crisis. If we don't work it out, that all we have to do after a disaster, we have to make sure we have contact with students. We have their records. We have a way of teaching, other than from the university. We have duplicates and degree works for our students, and so on and so forth. We can put compressed courses that are maybe 4 weeks or 7 weeks, or change the semester length, or we can play with all that. But we've got to have records, we've got to have students, and we've got to have a very strong process how we're going to reestablish courses. Because if our department doesn't run classes for 6 months, then this is pretty much the death of the department, right? So I'm telling you this is because often we look at those different pieces of a puzzle, and the very, very important piece is it has to be there before everything else. So for us is continuity of educational process to students. That's the essential function for us to exist. For a police department, it's something else. For a police department, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think that for you, the essential function would be dispatch. If you don't have dispatch, are you going to survive in delivery of your essential functions? Not as a supporter or emergency responder to that particular disaster, but you as an organization for the time being of that disaster. Right. So we have emergency operation plan for the university, what we're going to do, how we're going to manage volunteers and all that, where we're going to have staging areas, where our office is going to be located or whatever, or how the notifications have to happen if we're not coming to work, or the counterflow is implemented, because a lot of us live south of the university. So we've got those things, but that's emergency operation planning. Continuity of operation planning is that quiet planning for stability of your organization. That is the bread and butter of your organization. So that bread and butter, you've got to figure out what it is for you, for your organization. It's going to be different for Dalia and for, diplomatic security. What do you need to have to still have diplomatic essence in Mexico, right? What is the first thing you can't lose? What do you have to have in order to function? For the police, again, do you have, is the dispatch, which I would think that, you need to have it. For us is we need students, otherwise we can do webinars to, I don't know whom. So this is sort of going back and trying to think about COOP. And that main difference between emergency operation planning and continuity of operation planning is, in continuity of operation, you got to do the homework of, in your organization, what is the shared most important thing that has to be done before everything else gets done. Something that is you're not going to reconstitute if it's missing. And that, it's part of, that's how it links to the resiliency. Because a department will be resilient if it can, right, a week after disaster, reopen for business and have access to students and be able to patch courses, if the Blackboard fails, if everything else fails, do we have ways to have classes, under the tree or, in some other way? And do we have planning for it? Everything else that happens at our university, the fact that the hurricane affects students, or that the flooding did this, or that tornado destroyed the dorms, that's emergency operation planning. So I just want you to know the difference, because the continuity of operation planning is it's a different process than emergency operation planning. It goes parallel, it complements in a lot of ways, but it's also looking very much forward into way past the response phase. And that's where it's linked to short-term and long-term recovery, more so than any other emergency operation plan. Right. So in that continuity of operation planning, we have a really good example of how we sort of navigate through the event and to come out successful as an organization on the other end, and to have those capabilities, those capacities built into our organization. Vital records and databases. Yeah, we had as a university. Everything is automated, and so with smaller departments like ours, we know most of our students. But if you have huge departments on campus that the classes are a couple hundred people in the auditorium, and the undergraduate programs that are really large, then no collective memory is going to resuscitate that if redundant records don't exist. And we're so relying on technology, then it's harder and harder for space at the university, for ability for people to actually be able to catalog that stuff in sort of archival records. You this is a huge maintenance. We are so used to scanning and inputting and having everything in databases that the younger generation doesn't even often know how to index things in boxes and basements, and we are running those places on campus anyway. So it's harder and harder to have those backups. But of course, you can have electronic backups, and of course you've got cloud, and you've got all those hover technologies that help with the backup. So I just wanted to play a devil's advocate a little bit on that, on the essential mission function of the institution. The next, you had a discussion on the local recovery plan that was this network, business network, information network, and sharing databases with business and with private businesses and corporate partners. And Crystal was breaking down the components of that into situation awareness, dynamic context, intelligence decision support, and you had a discussion whether it would be, this system would be better for short-term recovery or long-term recovery. And I think that your consensus here, or you voiced your opinion that probably for rapid recovery this system would work really well if, again, those corporate entities were partners to it and were willing to contribute to it. Because a lot of issues with those integrated networks is that they are great ideas on paper, and people get very excited about them, but then when it comes to actually collecting data and inputting it and building the database, unless you have dedicated personnel for it, people don't do it as collateral. Or do it at the very last minute, or those systems are not updated. So again, it's costly for organizations because corporations or private businesses would have to create a position of somebody that is going to be a person in charge of maintaining this in a blue sky, what I call. And so it's a manufacturer, it's economical. So given you have somebody that is updating and keeping it updated and input stuff, and there is no issues with proprietary information as well, a lot of private industry, think about the oil business, in order for them to, a lot of stuff is patent, a lot of stuff is sensitive material, proprietary information. So how do they share those assets or resources if they don't have some sort of security assurance or some of the agreements of liability and so on and so forth to their stakeholder for breaches. For example, can you truly trust the federal government with cybersecurity, right, of your records? So you start sharing those public and private records, and those issues do come up. So it's a great concept. Probably really, really hard to institute. But I agree that very, very critical in short-term recovery. I think that John was talking about the foundation is building relationships, and that this kind of building of a network builds relationships, so people get to know one another. And I think you brought up, either Andrea or John, you brought up the Web EOC, which is the, maybe it was Crystal, you brought up the Web EOC as the emergency management sort of situational status boards that are accepted pretty much nationwide now as a platform for emergency management. Now, the state of Texas approved EOC years ago. I worked with I have worked with WebUC for a long time. There were proprietary software out of the West Coast, and at the very beginning, they were extremely expensive until the state government started using them for emergency management, and you started having those governmental licenses and educational licenses. But what WebUC is, and I have seen it play out over and over again, is situation boards. Situation boards that are populated by people as the event unfolds. And so there are status boards of resources, status boards of actions. Let's say hospitals can put their status boards for availability of their beds. I know that the Houston area, the Catastrophic Medical Operations Center, CMOC, they use WebUC as well. They have those layers of information, those situational boards that they'll make available if they want to show the status of their medical surge or capacity during a disaster. So, it's a platform that's being used. However, there are numerous entities, police departments, fire departments that got WebUC licenses, and they have WebUC, but they don't have dedicated personnel, again, that spends time on working on it. So when a disaster happens, of course, your administrator of the WebUC might not be there. And if somebody else doesn't know how to work within the system, then again, it's not very usable. And I've seen that happen during Ike. I saw that happen during Ike, and that was a while ago. And I also heard stories from Harvey about WebUC not being really the greatest because it's a status board. It's a situational status board. And so if nobody analyzes it, if nobody connects the dots, you actually really truly need analysts that are going to look at different things and bring it together. If you haven't had intelligence and information management class yet, this is maybe a conversation that relates more to that class. But the big capacity that we are missing with a lot of those solutions, software solutions, is analytical capability. It's the ability to actually condense the data, bring it together, and make meaningful inferences. So just the fact that somebody said on it, hey, I have 40,000 gallons of diesel fuel for generators, and somebody else somewhere else on a different platform said, hey, my hospital is the ER is going to go out because we need fuel for generators. If those two platforms, and those are two separate boards, status boards, if those two are not being analyzed in the same time by people that are going to be seeing how to connect those two, then there is no other system that puts it together, if you know what I mean. So analytical capability is critical. It cannot be a platform where people just put data in. It has to have oversight. It has to have people that run it, the redundancies. It has to be user-friendly. So if you don't have an administrator that typically does it, somebody else or people can be cross-trained for it. So again, technologies, do they make the system resilient? They can make the system brittle. Because, again, if you don't know how to index papers, because the only thing you know is how to drop files in the electronic format, then you are losing that, what I call old knowledge or old wisdom. And when your systems go out, then, you don't fall on that, analog process. And again, no technology in the world is going to replace human capability to do analytical assessment of needs, of priorities, of allocations. So, they're working on those systems, artificial intelligence, and so on. But until we have artificial intelligence, full blown in emergency management, maybe that's where the future is. the reliance on technology is your friend and the technology is your foe. So I think in the other Hangout you had a discussion on pagers, and I think John brought it up and said, we're dating ourselves when we're talking about pagers, but sometimes those technologies, this older technologies like ham radio operators and so on and so forth are really critical for resilience because we're again going to the redundancy and duplication and having several layers. So I think that those were my general comments from your first Hangout, and thank you for your participation in that. And I wonder if you have seen continuity of operation planning at your agency, and if you put your hands on it. I encourage you to look for one, or to find a copy of any continuity of operation planning and compare it to emergency operation plan for your agency, and see whether you can discern the differences, and also see how good your continuity of operation plan is for your institution or place where you work. So with that, thank you, and I'll see you shortly on my feedback on your second Google Hangout.